Welcome back to the EduPulse podcast. This is part 2 of 11 things I wish I'd learnt before stepping into a classroom. In this episode, we're going to have a conversation with Executive Principal Clare Hoods-Truman. Hello, Clare, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris.
Could you please introduce yourself to our wonderful listening audience and tell us a bit about yourself?
I certainly can. I'm Clare Hoods-Truman. I'm an executive principal, and I've been an executive head for about 9 years now. I'm also a national curriculum lead for personal development, PSHE and PE, and I'm a youth sports trust head teacher ambassador. And I predominantly work, or have worked, in the West Midlands region for the last 24 years.
So, Clare, let's have a think back. What was it like for you as a trainee teacher?
Um, well, going back, I suppose, 24 years now as a trainee teacher, I was in the very fortunate position that when I first started on what was back then probably my NQT year, I started in a school where there were 3 other NQTs starting at the same time. And it was in quite a well-established school where the teachers that had all been there had been there for about 20, 30 years. So um, we all kind of really supported each other, to be honest. And it was very much back then around trying to apply the things that you'd learned from university, but in a real life context, and being massively overwhelmed by workload and expectations, because I don't think university ever prepared us for that. But then
No.
also, it was around pretty much, I think most of it was learning on the job. We had a lot of freedom to kind of adapt and adjust the timetables, basically to kind of suit, really, I think back then, what we actually wanted to do. So things like if you wanted to go outside and do a writing lesson, then you would do it outside. Um, you could decide, like, one day I wasn't going to do history that day, we were going to do a whole week of it the following week. And there was a lot of flexibility and probably not a lot of monitoring and accountability, I think, at that time.
And yeah, that sounds completely different to the world that our teacher trainers are entering now. What thinking back, are there lessons that you'd wish you'd have known that would have been given then that you kind of missed out on that would have really come in handy in those first formative years?
Oh, it definitely would have been lessons around really going in and watching other people teach and learning from others. 24 years ago, it was pretty much you're in the classroom and you kind of got on with it, really. And there wasn't the level of interaction and support that I think the ECTs get now. So I think it would have been, for me, would have been going and asking questions and being really curious around things like curriculum structures, around a sequence of lessons, around assessment. And these were all things that I learned and I built on over time. But I think now we're in a culture around ECTs and initial teacher training where there's a lot more pedagogy out there to support our newly qualified teachers. But I think, there probably were opportunities back then, but I probably didn't realise that should have been something that would have been quite advantageous, I think, in me grasping fully and understanding the journey of learning and how children learn and
It's one of the
develop over
most
time.
uh, important concepts, isn't it? The whole idea of us as teachers and educators understanding whether or not the lessons that we have taught have been learnt. And I've been
Yes.
doing some training recently with some teachers, having that discussion. Has the young person in front of you learnt what you've been teaching? And to understand that, you've really got to get your head around some of the cognitive science that's quite prevalent these days. Are you finding that useful now as an executive principal in maybe some of the training that you might be delivering?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And I'm in awe of the level of training and support and CPD that um, my staff get around the science of learning, and how that whole thing of how do you, like you've just said, how have those children in the lesson actually understood what you've just taught them? How are you going to take that further? What are you going to do for those students that haven't grasped it? And it's we've really put a lot of time and effort into making sure that our staff get a really good suite of understanding around the science of learning, understanding assessment, understanding planning, a sequence of lessons, how we work together um, to co-construct a curriculum that's purposeful and that everybody has buy-in to. Because I think as a teacher, unless you have really good subject knowledge and you understand what you're teaching, then you're not going to be able to answer those questions around, how do you know that the children have understood that concept in your lesson today? How are you going to know that they're going to remember it in 2 or 3 weeks' time?
Absolutely. Well, some of the lessons that we had in part one that Adam and I were discussing, lessons 3 was about planning for misconception, and it was looking through sequence curriculums and the steps that you must take as a teacher to plan for all of those things that can go wrong. And sometimes you might come across a trainee teacher that hasn't quite thought that far ahead into the future. Is there any advice you'd specifically give about curriculum sequencing and putting lessons in the right order that you think a trainee teacher might benefit from?
I think the first and foremost, I think for any teacher, particularly trainees, is you've really got to know your children. You've really got to know your class that you're teaching. And for me, at primary level, you're in that advantageous position where you've got the same class of children in front of you every single day for that academic year. So it's really understanding where their starting points are, looking at data, and also the other factors around, holistically looking at personal development and well-being aspects, because that all
Hmm.
kind of dovetails into planning sequences of learning across the curriculum. I think the other really critical thing is to really understand and know the subject. Gone are the days you can't just go into a classroom and we have slide decks in my academies where each of the subjects have a slide deck, and you can't just pick them up and just teach them, because you need to understand what has gone on before, what's gone on in previous years, and then where do they need to go in subsequent years. So it's really understanding where that's all derived from, and working with subject leaders, ECTs within my academy work as part of a curriculum team, so that they get that opportunity to understand very, very early on in their career, how do we construct this English curriculum? Why have we put this in this place here? Why have we planned in those hinge questions for there? Why, where are you going to take it next? What are you going to do in terms of interventions? So they're constantly getting that in-depth level of support and knowledge that allows them to be confident enough to be able to ask the questions if they're still not sure, or to want to be part of co-constructing within their year group. So we do provide a lot of support around. We don't just give ECTs, oh, here's a slide deck and do this planning for this subject.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah, of course.
around, yeah, it's around, building that confidence to be able to say, well, actually, I'm really struggling with this concept. Can I work with somebody with a bit more experience? And obviously, things like the instructional coaching and aspects like that support the ECTs in being able to keep developing. ECTs are going to come in with the most relevant knowledge, their own ideas, their own experiences to bring to the table. But equally, I think, my piece of advice has always been, for the ECTs that start our school, is actually, you really think about why you chose to be here in our school, and why you picked us and
Hmm.
why we chose you. It's got to be around that you believe in the culture of what we're doing, and that you trust us, and you know that we're going to take you onto the next step of your teaching journey. So there has to be an element of, I think, lots of listening, but also lots of observing, and being actively engaged in that ECT process of building a really good relationship with the staff members, teams that are around you, and doing that high level of listening. but equally feeling confident enough that yes, you can ask questions. I'm really fortunate that the ECTs, or a lot of them over the last 9 years, have all stayed with us because we've built
Oh,
that
wow.
culture of open and honesty. I always keep saying they're my most expensive workforce because they they don't want to leave because they love the school, they love what they're doing, and they feel as though that they are part of that, and they're part of the journey, and they're part of the developments around teaching and learning and building capacity as leaders of the future. So it is all around kind of not going in as though you know everything, but equally definitely going in and being quietly assertive. But I think it's around making sure as well that ECTs understand who is who on your staff workforce. So, like, your best friend needs to be
Absolutely.
a Senko. You need to, your send children in your classroom. It's around, making sure that you are working with them and asking questions because SEND is a big minefield, and particularly around SEMH needs as well. So it's creating those opportunities for ECTs to be able to have that time to talk to key people within your school or your academy to be able to allow those opportunities for them to understand and know their pupils. We're also big believers in, I mean, we've got a 3 form entry school, so it's quite fortunate that if an ECT starts, they've already got 2 friends within the year group that are going to support them
Of
on
course.
this
Yeah.
initial journey. But it's, engaging with your community. The best way to get to know the children is also through talking to their parents, and people that also know them best. So, yeah, I think in the sort of answer to your question, it's kind of a blend of the two. Of always you're going to go in quite quiet in your first few weeks of teaching, but it's really, if you really want to know your pupils and you really want to make a difference, then it is about building and forming those relationships and being able to ask those questions when you're not sure or you need a bit more clarity. And obviously to fully engage in that ECT process around going out and seeing other people teach, asking them to come in and see you teach, and give you constructive criticism, team teaching, all of the things that I think as I grew up in teaching that I realised were probably fundamental in my development, which was team teaching and co-constructing lessons with people and then just teaching them together and developing each other as time went on.
Completely. Some amazing points there, particularly around those children who are disadvantaged through SEND or through any other way that's quite prolific in the storytelling at the moment, isn't it, within our
Mhm.
schools?
Yeah,
Finally, kind of, I guess, well-being and mental health
yeah.
is correctly at the forefront of everybody's minds at the moment. How important is it that ECTs and NQTs have and ITTs? Look at all these acronyms. We get lost with them all. People entering classrooms for the first time on their own. How important is it that they have good mental health hygiene?
Oh, absolutely important. We really need to look after our newly qualified teachers that are coming into our schools because we want them to succeed. We want to have outstanding practitioners that are going to go on and be the next generation of leaders that are going to take all of our schools and academies onto the next level of whatever that looks like. So I think it's definitely every school needs to think about the mental health and well-being, looking at workload, being realistic with ECTs. And I think in terms of the teacher training as well, I think it's critical that as our ECTs are training throughout their university life, that they do get that realistic picture of teaching is challenging. The workloads and
Hmm.
demands can be massively challenging, but you've got to get that balance. And the rewards are absolutely fantastic. They stay with you forever. The difference that you can make to individual children
Absolutely.
and cohorts and being part of that bigger picture of a school that makes a difference is absolutely life changing, and it really alters your perception of how you look at things. So um I think getting the right ECT mentor that is nurturing and
Hmm.
caring but challenging also, is absolutely critical. And building, again, everything goes back to building those positive relationships. And I think it's around making sure that we do it with our ECTs is they have somebody that checks in on them. They have their ECT mentor, but they also have a year group lead that can check in on them, check they're okay. Just basically asking them, at the end of the week, what are your plans, making sure that they have activities that they're doing outside of school. And I mean, well-being is such a massive part of my academies, and we make sure that we have a staff well-being workout session once a week, and all of our ECTs have to go to that. It's like you have to not mark your books for that half an hour, so that we're looking after your physical and mental well-being. So it's absolutely critical in this day and age, because as teachers as well, we're not just necessarily teaching, we're dealing with a whole host of other things, particularly post COVID. So I think that's high on the agenda, is looking after our ECTs, because we do want our profession to be the chosen profession of the future.
Well, absolutely. And that speaks to our first lesson that we had last episode, where we were talking about, above all else, be realistic and be kind to yourself.
Definitely.
Two things that are incredibly important. Claire, thank you so much for this really insightful conversation. There's loads to unpack there. And thank you so much for being our very first guest on the EduPulse podcast.
I am absolutely delighted and very honoured. Thank you for asking me, Chris.
A huge thanks to Claire for being our very first guest here on the EduPulse podcast. And now, back to 11 lessons I wish I'd learned before entering the classroom. Right, let's get back to these lessons that we were having a bit of a chat about. So we've done our first 5 lessons. So lesson 6, you've called drive thinking. Talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah, this really is just it's again simple in its essence, but actually quite difficult to put into practice. And I think that's the sort of key with a lot of these ideas. Really, they're all simple, but Joe Sparks, who's a leadership coach and thinker, said to me once that the difference between simple and easy is that easy is easy and simple's hard. And it's true. It's really hard to keep things simple, and to keep things simple does actually take quite a lot of thinking and careful planning. And this one, I think, really does sort of encapsulate that quite well. So yeah, the idea, the point of your teaching is for children to learn, and to learn they need to, as we've touched on already, encode that knowledge into long-term memory. And the way that they do that is by thinking about, what you drive those people to think about in your lessons is going to be the stuff that they remember and make connections to the things that they already know as well. So it therefore makes sense that when you're planning your lessons, you need to plan for what you want those pupils to be thinking about at each point, not what they're doing. And that's really, really hard to do, because the temptation is to go, oh, I want them to be writing a story, or I want them to be able to answer these these maths problems. And yeah, you do, but you want them to be able to do that as a result of the thinking that they're doing about those concepts that you've taught them. So as far as you possibly can, when you're planning lessons, think to yourself, right, this is the bit of the teaching that I'm going to do, this little portion of teaching here. What are the children going to be thinking about while I'm doing that bit of teaching? And then, as we've touched on earlier, how am I going to get a little bit of a window into that thinking to check that they're doing the kind of thinking that I want them to do? And then a stage on from that, when you set them off to any kind of independent practice, the point of the independent practice that they do, so the point of any activity that they do, is to scaffold them to think deeply about the concepts that you have taught. Mm-hmm. And I think that it is really simple in its essence, but like I say, it's actually quite difficult to do, but definitely one to keep in mind all the time.
Isn't that kind of touching back on one of the previous lessons where I mentioned about Tom Sherrington and that task completion is a poor proxy for learning? Because it's great, it's all very well and good if you've done a wonderful explanation. Maybe we'll go back to teaching about square numbers and how to square numbers. And then sending them away and doing 40 of them just straight away without any scaffolding and kind of almost moving into that world of overlearning where we've learned it now, there's 40, you only got 20 right, well, you clearly don't understand, let's move on, that is not the best way of teaching and learning. It is a way, and it's a way that's prevalent, and you see it done. But if we're striving for, you're just starting out in your career as a teacher, or you're starting out in your career as a leader even, and you're looking out for these things, those are not the best moments to be. You're not driving thinking, which is why it's important with the question you asked me earlier about what do you do with these rogue thinkers, these people who just come up with something that's not linked to it at all. What do you do with them? And I remember very vividly being in sixth form as an English literature student, and I didn't do great at sixth form with English literature. And I kind of put that down to the fact that I felt like I couldn't do rogue thinking. So I'd be that kid. I was Jack. I'd go off on all these tangents. What about this? It's linked to this. What about this? And my actual tutor said to me, she said, "You're thinking too much like a university student. I need you to actually answer me in this format now. You're thinking too esoterically about things, and I need you to be less like that, and I need you to answer in this kind of way." And it just didn't suit me. I couldn't play the game, and didn't do very well as a result. And this conversation has made me think about that, actually. Like, I don't think nobody drove my thinking. I was just taught how to pass the exam, and that didn't go particularly well.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a big part of it, isn't it? Is if it was about to produce stuff, rote like learning would be far more prevalent than happily what it is in schools now. I think the key thing as well that we're trying to get across with this one is that, particularly in like task design, think really hard about where you're drawing the pupil's attention to. So, as an example, lots of schools, year 3, year 4, they'll look at the Stone Age, right, and they'll learn about Stonehenge. And lots of schools, one of their sort of key overarching questions will be around the design and purpose of Stonehenge. So, what do you think Stonehenge was for? Now, I've seen quite a lot of lessons over the years where I've seen lots of this unit delivered lots of times, where teachers have wanted to draw attention to the spacing between the stones at Stonehenge. And on a few occasions, I've seen them do that by getting the children to construct Stonehenge from biscuits. So like out of like bourbons and custard creams, which, like, on the face of it, you think, oh yeah, amazing, wonderful, that'll be really fun, that'll be really engaging, because children, they love biscuits. And so if we're getting them to think about Stonehenge through the medium of biscuits, that's definitely going to work. It's going to hook in their attention. But actually what it does is the opposite. They obsess about the fact that, oh, this is cool, we're making something out of biscuits. So the attention is drawn to the novelty of that, rather than the attention being drawn to the spacing of the stones. And so you're getting them to think about something that is completely unrelated to what you actually want them thinking about. It's a bit as well, like another one you see quite a lot in year 6 is when teachers are doing World War II, and they're doing lessons on evacuees and what evacuees would have taken with them when they were evacuated. And you'll have lessons where, like, they'll be making cases out of paper and then writing on the inside the stuff that they would have filled this suitcase with. Okay, well, in some ways that is probably quite good fun for the kids, but where's the thinking? The thinking is going on to creating this suitcase out of paper, not onto the content and purpose of the things that evacuees would have taken with them.
We recently had a conversation, didn't we, about project learning, and once again, this being our very first episode, there's so much.
Yeah.
So if you are listening to this, dear listener, and thinking, "Oh, this is only touching the surface," it's meant to. We're going to be going into a lot more details over this first season. You're talking to me about project learning, and I do a tiny bit of that at my school. Yes, the efficacy of it is questioned at the moment, but it works for my young people. But that is because after a conversation with you and really talking about it, I think you gave the example of, they're doing a project on the Romans, and they're sat there and they've spent 3 hours building and painting a shield. And you ask the teacher or you ask the student, what are you doing? And they say, I'm making a Roman shield. Why are you making a Roman shield? Because Romans had shields. There's no acknowledgement of the actual learning that's going on there. So if behind it the reasoning actually is, well, they're learning construction, they're painting is maybe we're looking at the art curriculum, and painting and use of fine motor skills and shading is something we've been looking at. There is a bit more of an efficacy there than just, well, they're just painting, and a bit like if you said to your students, why are you building Stonehenge out of custard creams? And the answer came back, because we're trying to understand how they could possibly do it, and we're struggling with biscuits, so how would they have done it? And we're looking at space and sizing, and we took some measurements, and they're trying to actually recreate the physics of it. You could probably have a bit more of a conversation and understanding of how that might be a bit more acceptable, other than, oh, well, it's just a bit of fun with biscuits.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, like you say, does depend. It does depend on your context as well. I think with the Stonehenge example, I think that I'm not sure why you would put the distraction there. That makes sense. Like, yeah, you absolutely could strike it lucky, and you could get all of these kids thinking really deeply about the spacing of the stones. Like, absolutely, you could. But you're taking an unnecessary risk by trying to do that with biscuits, because there's a massive potential distraction there. I think, I mean, the example you gave about Kamichi, about your school, is that's a great one, because like we did speak about that a lot, like the night before your Ofsted, and like the detail that you guys have gone into around the thinking that you've done to make sure that, okay, yeah, we are doing some project-based learning, but actually when you take apart all of the different components of this project, so art, the art component, the science component, the writing component, when you take apart all of those components and you look at, right, where does that bit of art fall within an art progression?
Mm-hmm.
For you guys, it's from year 5, right? So where does it fall? Where does that piece of art fall within the progression? It makes sense. Where does the science fall within the progression? It makes sense. It's in the right place. Where does the writing fall? It's in the right place. The problem that I have with that kind of thing, with like project-based learning, when it's not done well, is yes, why are you making a Roman shield? Because our history topic is the Romans. So it's basically history drives what you do in all the other subject areas. Whereas actually, well, does the art curriculum say that at this, at year 3 or whatever it is that you're doing the Romans, that they should be working on painting? Probably, often not. A really good example of how it is done well is, funnily enough, just going back to that previous example, is on the Stone Age again. So lots of schools tend to have printing around year 3, year 4, which then means that you can do cave paintings quite naturally in year 3, year 4, and often that's when you're also going to do the Stone Age as well. So you can have that overlap there that happens quite naturally. But I think the key point is, like, just don't fall into this trap of going, right, I've got to make this fun and engaging and cool and relevant. Like, it will be interesting because it's interesting, because they understand it, because they experience success from it, not because you've used biscuits or watercolors or whatever it might be.
It's all about making meaning, isn't it? And
Yeah,
making
that's it.
Tangible. I think just to give a quick shout out to Gwyn ap Harry and the XP schools. So if anyone's interested in that, just give them a Google. XP. Their curriculum's 100% project based, and they've just got well, not just, but they're Ofsted outstanding. So it's we do know that it can happen and it can be done well, but it is not without forensic knowledge of the reasons why. Fab. Okay, so lesson 7 then, and we're heading back to our old pal Mr. Sherrington and his work of Rosenshine and Rosenshine's principles. Talk me through lesson 7, which is use talk but scaffold it.
Yeah. So in his book, Rosenshine's Principles in Action, Tom Sherrington has a beautiful little section on the importance of asking, what do you understand, rather than do you understand, and just how the simple rephrasing of that question can actually guide and change what children talk about when they're answering that question. So that was the reference to Tom Sherrington, really, on that one. And I think that the key message with that is that if you're if you're going to set children off to talk and discuss things, think really, really carefully about how you word that question, because how you word it will direct them to talk about, will show them the parameters of what it is that you want them to go and talk about. Quite often you'll see, or I see teachers sort of make a statement, a broad statement, and then go talk to the person next to you, or discuss that with the person behind you, or use your shoulder partner to discuss that. And the question's a little bit too broad, and it's not necessarily clear what would constitute an acceptable answer and what would constitute actually an acceptable conversation, and what would constitute an unacceptable conversation in that. And I think there's lots of people doing some great work on this at the moment around using talk. One in particular, if you can follow him on Twitter or X, a guy called Pritesh Raichura. So he's a secondary science teacher, and he did a fantastic video not that long ago of how he uses turn and talk in his classroom. So the idea is that he'll start off like he asks a question, and the kids will put their heads on the desk, and there's 4 possible answers. So it's a multiple choice question. He reads out each of the possible answers, and when the children think that the right answer has been read out, they just open their palms. So he can immediately see who understands and who doesn't, and where the misconceptions are. Then they all lift their heads up, and he says, okay, turn to the person next to you and explain why the correct answer is C. He gives them the answer. He goes, now explain why the correct answer is C. But because he's given them those 4 different options, that in itself helps structure that talk. So the kids go straight to the first one. They go, well, it's not A because this, it's not B because this, it's C because this. And so he's scaffolding their talk with that prompt. And you can do it as well with things like sentence stems. We do it quite a lot in my school. Actually, I've just working with a teacher that I've been coaching for the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks, and we've been working quite hard on this idea of providing a sentence stem to kickstart a conversation between two children, so it keeps them on task all the time. So you can use a visual prompt, or you can use a sentence stem to kind of really scaffold the thinking and scaffold the talk that will keep them on task, and make sure that 9 times out of 10 you get children talking about the thing that you want them to be talking about.
Yeah, and I think for everyone who's listening, everybody we've tagged in anything we've mentioned today in terms of other people in research, we can put in the description of today's episode. As an example for secondary, and particularly in English, I asked the question whether anybody thought that in Macbeth, Shakespeare was a feminist. And we had this discussion where it was year 10, so we were able to have a little bit more of a mature conversation, and one person put their hand up and said, well, feminism didn't exist at that time. So then we were able to bring in some other language, like maybe proto-feminist or things like that. But looking at the reasons why, through the character of Lady Macbeth, Shakespeare might be presenting someone who maybe supports the idea of feminism, or what feminism may turn out to be. But they were struggling they kind of said yes, and they knew why they were right, but they couldn't put it into words. So what I did was very similar. Without their heads down on the table, I just put 3 incorrect answers and 1 correct. So yes, Shakespeare is a feminist, and just left that there. And the other ones were the inverse of what the truth was, which Lady Macbeth is shown to have no agency, which she absolutely does. Lady Macbeth is shown to have no thought of her own and is deeply respectful to her husband. And they're like, well, that's not true. So in a way of making that inversion possible, the conversations where we were using words that I wanted them to use in an answer, such as the word agency, introducing that.
Nice.
What does that mean? So they were able to say, well, I think Shakespeare might be a proto-feminist because he was presenting Lady Macbeth as a woman of a household, but somebody who had her own agency, that felt like she could effeminize her husband, emasculate her husband right in front of her and other people. And all of a sudden, these much more mature conversations were happening, other than, yeah, I guess he was a feminist because she's a bit of a main character, which is nowhere near not where you want them to be in terms of exam answers, but not where you want them to be in terms of interpreting what Shakespeare had written and why he had done. So I think that's brilliant.
It comes back to that comes back to that previous lesson about driving thought. Like, what do you want them to think about? To what depth do you want them to think about it? that's your job, right? It is about driving the thought that the kids are doing in response to the teaching that you do.
But I think that leads us neatly into lesson 8, which is make sure your lessons are in the right order. It's like you've thought this through, because we're quite a transient school in the fact that we can have quite a high incoming of pupils at real crunch times within the school year, maybe SATs or year 9, when they feel that they can't really be coping in some mainstream settings. And so I see a wide variety of students at varying different points in their education, even though they're in the same year group as others. And it's clear those young people whose teachers have been forced to just go, here's the knowledge, go, and that's not a harm to the teachers. It's if they've had to cram in the knowledge, they've had to cram in the knowledge. But it certainly stops at a certain point. So then I need to make sure that, if the answers they're giving me are to link it back, yes, Shakespeare's a feminist because Lady Macbeth is a main character. If that's all they've been taught, I can't expect them to know anymore. So I have to go back to that previous lesson and drive thought. But I can't drive the thought if I haven't planted the seeds in a previous.
So this one really comes down to the fact that you can't do anything. You need to give children more to think with before you ask them to do any of the kind of real domain specific thinking that you want them to do. So I'll give you an example. So in science, we all want children to be able to plan and carry out their own experiments and draw conclusions from those experiments, but they can't do that unless they've got enough knowledge to think with to be able to plan and do those experiments. So they need the underpinning knowledge first to be able to do anything clever with it. Again, just a story from my early career. So I was teaching year 4. It was like my 3rd year of teaching, I think. And first lesson of a unit on electricity. And I got all of the electrical equipment out around the room, all of the wires and the bulbs and the buzzers and all that kind of thing. And I spread them out on the tables. Kids came in and I was like, right, guys, I want you to go to the tables and see if you can get the bulb to come on. And I thought, this is going to be great because they're going to be problem solving together and they're going to be figuring it out and they're going to be using what they already know, which was nothing at that point. And like within minutes, it had descended. Not even minutes, within like a minute, it had descended into absolute chaos. Like you had kids like they were fighting over the red wires because there was only a few of those. There was like children who were like tying each other up, like just around the wrists, but still tying each other up with wires. And like probably about 20 minutes after that, because I actually persisted with it and let it keep going. About 20 minutes after that, someone finally managed to get a bulb to come on. And I was like, right, everyone stop. Why do we think the bulb was come on? No one had a clue. Like absolutely no one had a clue. It was complete luck of the draw. So, but just because that lesson was just in the completely wrong place, they had no prior knowledge to bring to that. And so if they've got no prior knowledge to bring to it, it's just guesswork. So making sure that when you're planning units and sequences of lessons, which is always how you should plan anyway, always plan in sequences and blocks of lessons, but make sure that with each lesson you're thinking, right, do they have the relevant prerequisite knowledge? Do they know enough of the stuff that they need to know to be able to access what I want them to access in this lesson to come? And you just build that gradually as you go through the sequence, and eventually you will get to the bit where they can build their own circuit. But trust me, from experience, it's not lesson 1.
Well, and also as well, surely there's tools that go with that. Like you can't just hand them the tool and expect them to know how to use it. But similarly, I now know how to cork with silicone a kitchen and a bathroom, and that is because I watched a million hours of YouTube videos, and I was so confident. I had seen all of these bathroom. I'd seen, the sugar water. I'd seen this, everything. I knew what to do, and I picked up this tool for the first time, and I put it, and it all just started squirting out the other end because I'd never used the tool before. I had all of this knowledge about what I was going to do and how it was going to go, and I put the tool in my hand, and it didn't work. And so it's about having those two things at the right time in the right order. And so kind of like the inverse of what you had is I had all of this knowledge, so much domain knowledge that I knew exactly what to do at each point, but I'd never been introduced to the tool. So no one had shown
Yeah,
me the
yeah,
wire. No one had shown me the bulb. No one had talked to me about electrical circuits. No one had talked to me about a power source or a switch. And no one had spoken to me that the fact that the thing that holds the silicon is pressured. So when you push it, it's just going to keep on coming out. No one had explained that to me because I was trying to learn through only one through only one source.
source.
It's
Yeah,
crazy, isn't
definitely.
it? Do that to ourselves.
I think that's so relevant as well. Like children don't learn like children. Children don't learn like they do because they're children. They learn like they do because they're human beings, right? So
Yeah.
so we all learn in the same. We'll go through learning in the same way. And so a lot of it does come back to analogies like the one you've just given. Whereas when you think about when you learn to actually to do something and to put a process into action, the children are going through that exact same process. It's just that sometimes, particularly young children, have fewer and fewer connections that they can make to prior experience just by virtue of their age.
Well, you say that, and once again, that leads us perfectly into lesson 9. Help them to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really, really big one, and we'll definitely do another episode on this particular theme because it's massive and it's super prevalent, and everybody's talking about how we get children to remember more effectively. And there's tons and tons out there about retrieval practice that does need delving into in much more detail than what we're able to here. But yeah, as a headline point, try to make sure that your job does not finish at the end of that lesson. So if your job in that particular lesson has been to teach children to add 2 4-digit numbers together, try to make sure that you don't think, right, that's where that begins and ends. Bring it back again a few days later. And I don't mean reteach it, but give children an opportunity to try it again a few days later so that they can see if they can still remember it. As a general rule, leave a gap. So you don't need to feel the pressure of coming back to it every single day. You want to allow a little bit of forgetting to take place. And there's some really super interesting research about forgetting there at the moment. Some quite recent research coming out of some really exciting places about forgetting, which again we'll go into in more detail another time. But for now, the key message is teach something, allow a little bit of time for some forgetting to happen so that it becomes effortful for children to have to try and remember it when you want them to remember it, and then give them the opportunity to do that remembering a few days later. So again, doesn't need reteaching, just a few questions based on what it was that you taught them a few days previously. See if they can remember to do the thing that you wanted them to do. And the more kind of cycles of retrieval they go through over time, the more well embedded that piece of knowledge or concept will become in their long-term memories, and the more accessible it will be to them, so that easier they'll be able to get it into their working memories when they want it.
Yeah, to tease people slightly, you're potentially referring to kind of Azubel and the work that Sarah Cottingham's done recently on his work, and that I listened to a podcast, Ollie Lovell's Education Reading Research Room, that you pointed me to about a year ago, where she was talking about that the most valuable piece of learning is remembering what you've almost forgotten, because you've gone all the way to the very, very, you've pulled it back, and it's those that you're talking about allowing room for a little bit of forgetting. Like you said, it is another podcast or two, but I think the key takeaways there are really, really important.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we're coming to the end nearly. We've got lesson 10, where you say a mistake isn't failure, it's research. And I think you maybe hinted at this earlier in terms of control.
Yeah, so this is basically this quote: "Mistake isn't failure; it's research." It's adapted from a quote from Billie Jean King, where she said, "A loss isn't failure; it's research." And the essence being that you learn more from a defeat in a sporting context than you do from a victory. And I think in the context of teaching, you will learn an awful lot from the lessons that go wrong. But what you've got to make sure that you do, and what is really imperative to do, is to make sure that if you have a bad lesson, don't beat yourself up about it. Go back to lesson 1, right? Be realistic and be kind to yourself. But B, be really good at thinking about what went wrong in those lessons. And for me, and in my experience, like I said at the start, when I started, I was a bad teacher. I don't think it was all entirely my fault. I don't think I had like the best training at that time, but my my kind of attitude and preconceptions about what teaching was were totally wrong, right? And so when I started, it really was not good. And I remember the head teacher at that first school I was at. She was desperately trying to find something to be positive with me about as I was kind of coming to the end of my time there. And she was like, well, and I'll never forget her saying, she goes, well, we've never seen Priscilla so happy to come to school. It's like, great. So out of a class of 30, one child is quite happy to come to school. That's like not even a hit rate of like 4% or something, is it? So, it really, I can't stress to you enough, like how bad my start to teaching was. But what I got really, really good at really early was being very good at thinking hard about the things that had gone wrong in lessons. And for about the next year after I left that first school, that was what I basically devoted my time to. Was I'd teach a lesson, it would go wrong, I'd be like, right, I've got to think hard about what it was that went wrong in this lesson. So I would read and listen to tons of stuff that would kind of give me clues as to what it was that I might have gone wrong with in that particular lesson. Then I'd pore over that lesson plan, and I'd pore over future lesson plans to try and make sure the same thing didn't happen again. I'd check the questions that I was going to ask throughout my next lesson really, really carefully and think hard about, right, am I driving thought about the right thing with that particular question? I'd like rehearse lessons and particularly rehearse explanations, and I'd go again and again and again and again to try and get them clearer and clearer and clearer, because I just hated that feeling of being in a class and going, oh, I haven't thought through this explanation properly, and now I'm starting to lose them because I'm getting confused myself. So I'd run through those over and over again. I'd practice models, I'd check things with colleagues, and I'd just make absolutely sure that I was the absolute best at addressing the problems that had come up in lessons. And I put so much time and energy into that, almost became like a machine in my early career. After a mistake, I'd like go to this like totally different place where I was just so determined to make the next lesson better. And I think that's the key, really. Alongside that thing of be realistic and be kind to yourself, it's this as well, as it's, without, I'm not saying, work 100 hours a week or anything like that. You should never do that, but devote lots of your time and energy and thinking into how to make lessons better. There's a lot of other stuff that is peripheral, but try to devote as much time as you possibly can to those areas and get really good at thinking hard about getting better.
Yeah, I think as well, there is some time you can dedicate to, not too much in terms of what went well. You can be like, that was really good. Identify, you don't dwell on it. No one's going to give you a ticker parade or a tour through the city on top of an open top bus. But I think looking strategically at the things that went well in the same kind of vein, that same kind of detail. Why did this work? Because sometimes it may be that it's I don't know, it was a sunny day outside and people wanted to be part of a good day, and everyone was just having, happy feelings everywhere, and there was, and you go, oh, it wasn't me. But I think that leads neatly on to your last lesson 11. You are about to have a purpose to your day that most people will only ever be able to dream of. And obviously we've spent a lot of this episode talking about, or touching on, should I say, some of the really key, deep pieces of thought that are happening within education right now, that are becoming more prevalent, that are becoming more of the headlines and the conversations, particularly over on Twitter. I won't call it X. I'm going to be really, really but certainly in circles where these conversations matter, it's possible to feel like the profession is doing itself down. We are living in a time of high teacher scrutiny. And I guess this final lesson from you might be the most important of all.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's certainly the sort of simplest of all, really, because it's one that, again, it's there already, and you don't have a great deal of control over it. Like you say, that last lesson we just talked about, a mistake not being failure, it's research, and we talked a lot about the things that are actually within your control and about getting better deliberately, like really making sure that you obsess about getting better at stuff. in a healthy way, right? But this one is about the sort of innate value of teaching. So before I was a teacher, I was a tennis coach, and I used to coach. As one particular guy I coached who was the managing director of Goldman Sachs. So this guy had, you know, a lot of money and like a really great life on the face of it. He was like traveling left, right, and centre. He had all the nicest cars and all the rest of it. And I remember him saying to me once, because I was teaching at the same time as tennis coaching in the early part of my career. And I remember him saying to me, like, it's Adam, honestly, it's a trap. Like, it's an absolute trap. He's like, you know, I go to work every single day for 12 hours, and I've built this lifestyle around this extortionate amount of money that I earn, which means I can never go back. So I've got to stay where I am or push forward. I can't ever take a backward step now. And I've got no purpose whatsoever to anything that I do. I just make a load of money for other people, and then they give me some of that back. And he said, what you do is far more purposeful. And, you know, it does kind of get a little bit deep, I suppose. But when you think about like what you want for your life, I think spending your life doing something purposeful and something meaningful, there's enormous value in that. And it's not the kind of value that's ever going to buy a second house or a fourth car, but it's value that you're going to take with you right the way through your life. And I'm honestly, I don't think I'd do anything else now. I really, really wouldn't. There's lots of other jobs that are great and are really rewarding, but I'm not sure there's anything that is rewarding in quite the same way that teaching is, because of the purpose that you serve every single day. And I think, especially if you've never done any other job, like really try and hold on to that early on in your career. I have done other jobs, I know you have as well, but if you're someone that if you're going from university, if you've gone from school to university and then you're going back into school to teach, just really try and hold on to the fact that you have got a purpose to your day that 9 times out of 10 other people do not have, and they would love to have. They really, really would. So yeah, enjoy it and make most of it, because yeah, like I say, not everybody has that.
I think my advice to our ICT and ECT listeners for this specific episode about the 11 lessons you wish you'd have had before stepping into the classroom, I think right now one of them is to really focus on the day-to-day, focus on the mission, focus on the kids. Let's get the mobiles out of classrooms. Let's stop filming it for TikTok, because that's not where education is. And it's certainly not where it should be. And focusing on your lessons, focusing on your young people, focusing on the team you're in, and hopefully, if you have ambition for it, the team you may one day lead and echo and bring to others, I think is my key piece of advice, is that you're listening to this or you're training because it's a job you want, and it's some people say, you know, it's not a calling, it is a job at the end of the day, and there is a healthy level of that, but there are things that are expected of you in this job that do go above and beyond maybe a standard 9 to 5. And don't get me wrong, there are days where I wish a 9 to 5 was all I did, because it happens to everybody, right? Everyone has their dips, but I think your lesson is important to come back to remember that you have a purpose that most people could only ever dream of, and I think that's just a really nice point to end on.
Fantastic. Are there any others that we've missed out, do you think? Any others that you particularly pertinent, close to you?
Any lessons?
Yeah.
No, I think you've really thought them through, and I think they're really well sequenced, and they all flow into one another. My one lesson that I wish I'd have learnt, I guess, would be about not being so hard on myself. It maybe feeds into lesson 1.
Mm-hmm.
The expectations of my own abilities were so high that it was crushing, and a bit like your Goldman Sachs guy, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't step back. My energy was too much. I was then because I started as a peripatetic music teacher, so going into different schools. I was the fun guy. I was the funny one. I was doing the singing and the music, and the teachers were grateful that I was there because they could do their PPA or put up displays whilst I was running a choir, you know, with those really quiet staple guns that go into walls whilst you do. And I guess, those are the moments that I just I really wished I hadn't gone that hard, and I went that hard because I thought it mattered, and I thought it mattered to not the kids. I thought it mattered to the people who were employing me, and I didn't have the young people in my vision. I had, what is this for me? Am I doing a good enough job? And the people that I always sought that acceptance from was never the kids. It was from the people who might hire me to do another. And I feel like I missed a lot from my early career, not being able to. Some of these things that we're talking about today, I've only come up across in the past 3 or 4 years. I've been teaching for a lot longer than that, so alongside being a lesson about being kind to myself, perhaps being kind to myself would have been to have been more evidence informed, which is, I guess, what we're trying to do. EduPulse, right? We're trying to bridge the gap between the research and the classroom, turn it into something that's palpable, because we can all go to these brilliant seminars and hear all these wonderful people talking, but the people who are going to those things are leaders and people who can have time off school, and then they get to the classroom and it's disseminated down through insets and whatnot. So I think those would be my two, I think.
Awesome. Well, it should be a really exciting journey, this EduPulse journey. So it'd be great for everybody to kind of follow us along as we go through, and we talk more and more about different research topics and how they apply into the classroom. We're going to try and keep it as practical as we possibly can, aren't we? And try and make sure that the advice that we give is really actionable, so that people can kind of take stuff away and put it into practice straight away without kind of needing to do too much of the sort of interpretation work yourself. There's always going to be those contextual factors that people always have to think about, because every context is completely different. But we're going to try and give you kind of a base of how you can take particularly influential and popular research and put it into practice in your classrooms immediately for good effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we formed EduPulse because we wanted to have a bit of nuance in an increasingly binary world. And you're either trauma informed or you're not, or and that's just not the reality of classrooms that we have. So if anybody out there is interested in taking part in the podcast, or they have some comments or questions or areas they'd like us to feature, you can follow us on Twitter. We're EduPulse Co, and we are online at www.edupulse.co, and you can grab us there and send us any thoughts and feelings that you like. We've got we've got publications coming out. We've got this podcast. So and over the next the next few months, we've got some epic guests, which we won't reveal now for you, but we've got some really, really cool guests that are going to be coming on to the podcast. So we really hope you've enjoyed. Please subscribe and share, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the 2-part special first episode of the EduPulse podcast. We'll be back soon with more conversations and advice for those of you starting your teaching career, and head-nodding moments with our special guests. As ever, please head over to Twitter and join in the conversation at EduPulse Co, and we'll see you next time.